Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this session, which is focused on the future of urban transport. And in particular, we're going to look at London as a case study of a big city where big questions are being asked about urban transport and the future of it. I'm Andrew Carter, Chief Executive of the Centre for Cities, and my guest today is Vernon Everittt. Welcome, Vernon. Vernon is the Managing Director of Customers, Communication and Technology at Transport for London, so a perfect person to think about and talk about the future of urban transport. Let's start, Vernon, going before COVID. Mm-hmm. Since you've been watching and understanding the trends and patterns, how people are using London's transport system, what were the sort of patterns that you were observing before COVID hit?
Well, if we wind the clock back to the very beginning of the creation of Transport for London and the creation of the London Mayoralty, which was critical to setting a really clear policy objective for transport, we've seen a very, very significant mode shift out of cars and into public transport. And over the last decade, we saw that mode shift of about 7.5%, 8%. So that we're in a position where 63% of all journeys in London are on public transport or active travel, walking and cycling. And at the same time, over the same sort of period, we've seen, as a proportion of total journeys, car traffic fall from 39% to 35%. So we've seen a very significant shift to public transport, walking and cycling, and a reduction in car journeys. And that, pre-COVID, was a continuing trend. I mean, the speed of the switch probably was more pronounced in the earlier part of that decade, and it slowed a bit. But that's probably a function of the growth of London's population.
Yeah, and because I think this is important for when we think about post-COVID. Talk a little bit about, the way that modal shift, came about, in the sense that, TfL itself was doing a whole lot. The population itself was changing, and you were doing things on the supply side, changing the offer, but also then thinking about demand management and all of these sorts of things were playing off. So say a little bit about how you thought about that and how you brought that about.
Well, I think fundamentally it was the quality, frequency and efficiency of public transport. Post the Second World War, there was very little investment in public transport in the UK, and it fell into a state of disrepair. And a lack of reliability means that people don't use you. Now, towards the late 80s and early 90s, people started to realise that an effective and an efficient public transport system is absolutely central to economic growth, housing development, and all those other good things, sustainability, all those other good things that you want out of your capital cities and engines of your economy. So the investment started to go in. The tube was upgraded, old legacy signalling, past their sell-by date trains, all of those things were swept away. Bus network was fundamentally changed. You literally turn up and go. You don't need to look at a timetable to get a bus in London. You go to the bus stop and one will be along soon. So that investment in high frequency, clean, efficient transport was absolutely critical to that, alongside improving the experience of customers. So things like the introduction of the Oyster card and latterly using contactless payment cards to actually pay for journeys, which of themselves just tie together all of the different modes of transport. And that enabled us to introduce a flexible and effective ticketing system where people literally just turn up, tap and go. So it was a combination of a number of things, but it really started with investment in improving the offer so that people had a decent alternative to using the car.
And just for colleagues who are less familiar with London's transport system, because I think again it touches on the future, so understanding where we've been I think is really quite important. Say a little bit about how that was paid for. Right, you talk about this kind of substantive investment over a prolonged period. Just say something about how that investment was paid for, where the money was coming from, where the revenues come from. Because again, I think that has as you well know, it has an implication then for the future as well. And it differs from in London than it does in other cities in the UK, but also different cities across the globe as well.
Well, if we look at revenue first, about 75% of our revenues are derived from fares. And a substantial part of the remainder is also derived from other sources, other commercial sources like advertising on the London Underground network. So the more people that use us, the more fare revenue we got, the more we were able to invest and reinvest. Because we're not a profit-making organisation, we reinvested that money back into the public transport system. As far as capital expenditure is concerned, that does need government support. And in the early days of TfL's creation, there was a 5-year grant period with the Department of Transportation in the UK, which gave an amount of money that went into re-signalling, buying new trains, upgrading the bus network. But over time, and we will always need, because of the size and scale of the capital programmes, the Elizabeth line, which we will open in the first half of next year, it's a £15 billion programme, and you need some help. But we also got businesses, the users, and the recipients of some of the benefits of investment in public transport to pay too, through various levies and development levies. So Crossrail has been very heavily financed by the business community in London as well, through business rate retention and things like that.
And that was an important element in actually getting it through the government, right? In the sense that London, in a broader sense, was prepared to pay, for certain aspects of the investment programme, in part, rightly, because London, in general, benefits from those sorts of investments.
Exactly. So it had to be that combined effort. And into the future, I know we'll come on to the pandemic in a moment, but we will continue to need help through a combination of government, the private sector and others to continue with that capital investment while we sort out the operating costs of the organisation. So before the pandemic, actually, we were almost breaking even on our operating costs, which is almost, I think that's pretty much unheard of anywhere in the world. But you do need help for those big capital programmes.
Yeah, of course. So, prolonged investment programme over a 20-year period. We arrive at the footsteps or the doorstep of the pandemic with a world-class transport system that has been instrumental in allowing London to recover and really to thrive over that 20 to 30-year period. I mean, just take us through, the immediate effects of COVID. In a sense, COVID happens and we go into a lockdown period relatively early March of 2020. I mean, what happens to the transport system in those early days? And then we'll talk a little bit about how then it's evolving and changing. But just give us an immediate effect that it had.
Well, our whole reason for existence was turned on its head, as it was, I think, for colleagues all around the world, actually. So we went from a position where we were encouraging people to use public transport to telling people not to use it. And the objective was to drive down ridership, not build it. So, and for obvious reasons, for health reasons, and to be able to control the pandemic. So we went down on the London Underground. We went down to 5% of pre-pandemic ridership. On the buses, it went down to about 20% of pre-pandemic ridership. So incredibly dramatic. And our whole reason for being changed, and the safety and well-being of our customers and our staff, which is always top of our agenda, just became that more acute, because the people that were continuing to travel literally had no choice. They were the people that were going to hospitals. They were the NHS workers and other key workers that needed to keep the country going. So it was the biggest shock to the system that you could possibly imagine.
And those big, huge drops, I presume a large proportion of that was essentially, those people that were using the system to commute in and out of work, often from out to in a classic kind of radial fashion, essentially overnight took their jobs home with them.
Yeah.
And the corresponding effect, not only did they take their job home with them, but those that were reliant on those jobs, people that were in the service industries, local amenity services activities, were then without a job, went on to furlough, and since they didn't need to travel. Is that right? Just give us a sense as to the impact of that work from home effect.
Yeah, well, I mean, London is a big commercial centre, and a lot of the jobs that are conducted from London, use modern technologies, and therefore the transition from the commute, even though we were seeing travel patterns changing even pre the pandemic, but the pandemic meant that many more people went from work from home, and I think people were pretty surprised about how effective that was, where technology systems and Teams and Zoom and all of those sort of things suddenly took precedence, and that meant that particularly in the central activity zones of London, the core central London area, Canary Wharf, that meant they were pretty deserted, and all the ancillary businesses, as you mentioned, that rely on the existence of a thriving office community struggled, sandwich bars and all the rest of it. So I think the pattern in London was pretty much the pattern that was experienced by every major city in the world, where the clear government instruction was to stay home.
Yes, and it was and you see this, you're right in the sense, the patterns of our, big cities in the UK, Leeds and Manchester and Birmingham, very similar patterns, quite a dramatic fall in the sense because the strengths that they had big office worker hubs, big centres of creativity and dynamism, driven by those workers coming in on a daily or fairly frequent basis, all of that kind of stopped overnight.
Oh, literally overnight.
And you said a little bit about the way that Transport for London as an institution is funded. I mean, just what kind of immediate effect did that have on the institution as an urban transport authority in terms of cash coming through the door?
Yeah. So the fare revenue dropped by over 90%. And although we have reserves and all the rest of it, which enabled us to keep going for a few months, that is the core revenue for us, and it literally just dried up for reasons that we fully understand. And that meant that pretty soon, just like other transport operators in the UK, we had to start talking to central government about how we kept things going, because it was not an option to stop. Of course, our staff were equally as affected by the pandemic.
Yes.
Train drivers get ill, bus drivers, we lost many bus drivers. We've lost 93 colleagues to COVID across the transport industry in London. So there was a combination of dealing with the money side of things, but also dealing with the human side of things, and just making sure that we were taking every step we possibly could to keep both our customers who were travelling and our staff safe, which was an incredible challenge.
So that was the immediate, almost overnight effect. 5% usage on tubes, 20% there or thereabouts on buses. And then just take us through that. It's like, lockdown period begins to ease, particularly as we go into the summer period of 2020. How did then sort of usage and engagement with the system begin to evolve and respond?
Yeah, it started to respond when people could do things. So people don't generally make journeys for the sake of making a journey. You're going to do something. You're going to go to the theatre, whatever it happens to be, or go to work. So as the lockdown restrictions were eased, so we started to see people coming back. And that really has accelerated now that during 2021, many of the restrictions that were put in place have now been set aside. And we saw in the early days, as more leisure opportunities were opened up, the leisure market started to come back. And it's only, you and I, Andrew, are talking now at the beginning of October. It was only really in the early part of September 2021 that we started to see a material return to work. The recovery hitherto was largely about leisure traffic and domestic tourism, actually. In the middle of 2021, the Mayor created a Let's Do London campaign, which we supported, and we started to see domestic tourism pick up as well and drive revenues. So it's been gradual, the recovery. The UK government set out a 4-stage process for releasing restrictions. And the final one of those was instigated in July. And that's really been the signal for companies to start thinking now about their working model and how they're going to operate in future.
And, the classic sort of story about the use of London's transport system is huge numbers of people up until about 9:30 in the morning, kind of, drop off during the day, and then these huge spikes in the evening rush hour, and overwhelmingly, but not exclusively, radial, so in to out and then out to in. How has that evolved? How has that changed? Obviously, the overall numbers were much lower, but was the pattern of usage changing as well?
On your radial point, there was much more activity in outer London.
Right.
So we were seeing lots of bus trips, for example, in the outer parts of London. So while central London was very quiet, the recovery was being felt because people were living in their local neighbourhoods a lot more than they would do normally, and working in their local neighbourhoods, whereas they might otherwise travel in to the centre of town. But we've seen that shift now. We're, as I say, we're speaking in October, and we're now seeing nearly 60% of normal ridership on the London Underground every day, every weekday. Yep. As a proportion of ridership, although the quantum is lower, at weekends that's even higher. Okay. So we're seeing over 70% of normal ridership on the London Underground at weekends. And on the bus network, we're at about 75-80% during the week, and north of that or roughly the same as that at the weekend. So we really have, since the beginning of September, when we were trending at 40-45% of normal ridership on the tube, we're now at 60. There's a real sense that the centre of the city is starting to open up again. Yeah. But it was interesting in those early days. Early in the lockdown, nothing. About halfway through, you saw the evidence of that outer London pattern developing, and now in the latter stages of the last lockdown, we started to see a more broad-based recovery, although it's still lower, of course, than pre-pandemic.
No, it's a good point, and I think you've outlined some of the reasons why, but we've seen this particularly again in our big cities in the UK. We've been tracking their performance on a number of footfall measures. Obviously, you do that incredibly well in London. The cities have almost come back initially as on the consumption, on the entertainment side, see more activity in the evenings and on the weekend than you do during the weekdays. In a sense, people are less reluctant or less needing to go into work, but increasingly open to going in on the weekend or of an evening, for an entertainment purpose or whatever it might be.
That's right. That's what we've seen. Again, you don't travel for the sake of it. You travel to do stuff, and people need to have a reason to travel. So,
And how is where you've got to now? I mean, how does that then affect the future and the future scenarios that you've got? In a sense, as again, one of the scenarios we've held for quite some time in London collectively, which is ongoing and almost permanent population growth, for example, a continuing densification and growth actually of the central activity zone of the CBD area, and really the story about King's Cross and Paddington and London Bridge is about the expansion of the CBD, in my view, rather than a contraction, and I think that's likely to continue in my view. But those have been sort of deeply long-held views. They've been held views by colleagues at TfL as well. As well as the mayoral institution. Do they still hold? Have they evolved? I mean, where are you on that?
I think they still hold. The fundamentals behind why agglomeration works and bringing everybody together for the reasons of creativity and other things that you described have not gone away. And London and the South East continues to be a really major powerhouse for business, business and finance and education and culture. And those things haven't changed. I think the thing that we've yet to see, and I think it's too early to call it, is quite how work will evolve. I mean, there are as many views as people really about this. and some firms are already obviously taking the view to get more people back earlier because of creativity, because that's the way people develop and learn and become more skilled. And it's also interesting just to see what's happening in the office rental market as well, where demand is still very high in London for quality office space. I think what's happening is that the purpose of the office is being questioned or reevaluated. And, there's no point in having the office if it's just to come and do your Teams calls from the office.
Yes.
But if you're coming in to discuss strategy, to get together as a team to work through strategies and problems and issues, people are starting to come back and think about the office in a different way. And interestingly, the flexibility that some of that might introduce to the office rental market is interesting, because there are some people that would say that there are some small and medium-sized enterprises who can take advantage of the more flexible office space which is now growing up around the place, to be able to position them, to be able to base themselves in London for a couple of days a week.
Indeed.
So you may well end up with individuals making fewer journeys, but the quantum of people making those journeys is higher.
Absolutely.
And all of the evidence is suggesting that the seeds of that are being sown. So it will be interesting to develop. And also, you asked about the pattern during the course of the day. Even at the height of the pandemic, we had a morning peak because there were people who simply can't work from home. If you're a construction worker,
Yes.
you can't do that from home. The early morning peak shifted an hour earlier. And as we've come out of lockdown, it started to form a fairly similar shape, but with more people travelling in the between the peaks. So I think also what's happening out there is employers are thinking about, okay, why do I have to have everybody in at 9 o'clock? Can we do it 9:30, 10:30, start the day at 10:30? That's not possible with everybody and the different nature of their businesses. But for many people who aren't wedded or chained to that sort of time frame, people are starting to seek flexibility, and that's important for customers as well, because they want to travel as comfortably as they can.
I think one of the possibilities from the patterns that you're suggesting is that the labour market of London grows quite considerably in terms of it gets further away. If you're only coming into London twice a week, actually you're going to do that hour and a half commute either way suddenly becomes, still you want to do it, but you're prepared to do it twice a week rather than 5 days a week. So the geography of London extends quite considerably. I guess that has some real kind of operational challenges for the Transport Authority about how you integrate, how you coordinate, over that sort of geography. Would you say a little bit about where your thinking is on that?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Well, we've got a live example of what you're talking about, Andrew, with the introduction of the Elizabeth line in the first half of 2022, which in one go will introduce 10% more rail capacity for London and the region. And the journey times from Reading into central London or to Heathrow or to the West End are just being concertinaed. Much faster journey times, which means that people's accessibility to London and the central activity zones of London will be improved immeasurably. So and I think one of the things that we need to address is the integration of the heavy rail network with the Transport for London network. Now, Transport for London runs quite a bit of rail when we run our sort of M25 London Overground service, and we're running the limbs of what will become the Elizabeth line when the central section and the other sections eventually open. But the integration with the individual train operators who service London is really important, and we work very closely with them on planning. We don't plan and produce our strategies in isolation. We do get together because it's a regional thing. And frankly, as a customer, you don't really care whose logo is on the side of the vehicle. All you're interested in is being able to make the journey that you want to make efficiently, effectively, and for a decent price. So we are looking, in the advent of Greater British Railways and the new approach to franchising and things like that that the Department for Transport are looking into, I think means that we'll be more integrated than ever with the train operators.
Yes, and just on that theme of integration, just say a little bit about, what's been TfL has always been a critical component the critical component in many respects of the London Mayor's set of institutions. In what way has that sort of shaped the way, what TfL has done directly and indirectly? I mean, just to say, because that's not the case in many other places. No. They often run very differently or very separately. So again, just, what's that brought to the table?
It's meant everything. So prior to the advent of the mayoralty in London, it was only introduced in the year 2000. Things were looked at spatially, economically, and from a transport perspective in silos. And what the advent of the mayoralty has done is brought all of that together. So you have a lock-up of an economic strategy for a spatial strategy, and also a transport strategy. And all of those things are linked. And pulling them all together and looking at them in that way. And the mayor is legally obliged to produce a transport strategy, which sort of lays out the strategic framework going out on the current edition of the Mayor's Transport Strategy out to 2040. So what the advent of the mayoralty did is it forced is the wrong word, but it enabled us as a transport authority not just to focus on getting the service out every day. Important though that is, because the city doesn't work if we don't work and operate an efficient transport system. It's vital. But the advent of the mayoralty and that longer term view meant that spatial planning, the strategy around which schemes you invest in and all the rest of it just became that much easier to talk about, to lobby for, and actually to fund, because business groups could come in and influence that, customer groups could come in and influence that, accessibility groups could come in and that. I mean, one of the things we're most proud of, and this is a work in progress and a constant work in progress, is how much more accessible public transport is. There are 1 million Londoners who at any one time will have some form of accessibility, a disability, a permanent disability, or maybe they've had an operation or whatever it happens to be. And we've got to make that transport system accessible to everyone. And again, the mayoralty and the focus on those social outcomes that we need to deliver alongside the economic ones has been absolutely vital to driving everything and tackling road congestion.
Yes.
So one of the things we didn't touch on is what's happened on the roads, and the vehicular traffic has recovered much faster than public transport, particularly in outer London. And the advent of the mayoralty has enabled this strategic view to be taken of the balance between public transport, walking and cycling, and providing people, it's not being anti-car, it's giving people options, better options, and more sustainable options for their journeys. Without having a democratically elected mayor in charge of all of that, and the mayor is our chair, Transport for London's chair, we would not have seen the progress, the incredible progress that's been made since the year 2000.
No, quite. Such an incredibly powerful kind of message about institutions and where they sit and the credibility that they are given and the legitimacy they're given as a result of that.
Absolutely.
I think it's just incredible.
And it's great that we're seeing that around the United Kingdom.
Yes.
With democratic elected metro mayors really driving the agenda for their local regions. It's been a real game changer.
Yeah, and it's an unfair kind of big question to finish with, Werner. But I mean, when you think back to the experience that you've gone through as an institution over the last 18 months or so, I mean, what are the kind of big lessons or takeaways for TfL and therefore for others in thinking about urban transport? What have you taken away that you'll use again when we think about the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, well, from a customer and staff perspective, it's all about their safety, and safety is always the top priority. And this last 18 months has really accentuated all of that. And I'm not sure we could make ourselves more acutely aware of the importance of running safe systems, but this period has. I think the other big thing from a customer perspective is it hasn't really changed the fundamentals of what customers want from their public transport network. It's just heightened them. So people want a safe, clean and orderly service. They want value for money, and they want to see progress and innovation that makes their lives easier. Oyster, better customer information. You know, the other thing that has happened during this period is that we've sort of almost turned our customer information on its head to focus on busyness, because people want to know, how busy is my station?
Yeah.
Well, we've got real-time information now that tells you how busy your station is before you leave the house. So I think on the graphic equaliser, the sort of eternal verities of what our customers and what businesses, politicians and others want out of a public transport system have just been heightened, and the sensitivity to those things has been heightened by the last 18 months.
That's a great way to finish, to bring this session to a close. My huge thanks to my guest, Vernon Everett, and thanks to all you for watching. Take care.